If we're ready, then let's go.
On your mark.
3, 2, mark. So these days, the internet is full of different apps.
And crypto bros.
And these apps have done something we think is not the best for the community on the internet. Which is why we want to talk to you today. Not only about the apps, but also about everything that has happened to the community on the internet over the past many tens of years.
So our basic argument is that there used to be a collaborative web, an internet where people were talking to each other, making communications, having a dialogue, and that we're now increasingly stuck in all of these deadly sins of one-way communication where people send each other pictures of their latest outfit or what they ate, and it's all broadcast. It's all about having the maximum amount of followers while having the fewest amount of people that you are yourself listening to. And so what we hope that we will convey to you in the upcoming 50 minutes is firstly why we profoundly disagree with this way of organizing the internet, and also how we believe that we might be able to make steps to get to a better place, both using technological and social means.
So why is the internet different now than it was in the beginning? Do you remember? I don't see anyone with that much gray hair. When ARPANET was created just before the 70s, right? It was quite different. Now, why was that the case? Now, being old on the internet is not easy.
What was the first time that you used the internet, actually?
I think it was, I was under 10 years old, and I was going to this extracurricular activity, because at home I didn't even have a PC. I had a Soviet clone of ZX Spectrum. It was really great, yes. We were doing lots of exploration before 2000, yeah. We were playing Quake.
1990s internet.
Yeah. That was quite cool.
Those were the days.
So this here, right? This text, you can read it. You can read it and say, "What the hell is that?" Or you can read it and immediately have the right tune pop up in your head.
I don't think that's the right tune. I think it's out of key, but we've been disagreeing on this for about 2 days.
That's what the presentation is about, us disagreeing here on stage. But since this is a hacker conference, a kind of security conference, we have to talk about security, of course. Now, I believe that when internet was first created, and I wasn't there, I'm not that old, because when I started using internet, we were playing Quake, but there were already, I guess, people that were hacking stuff. But back before then, in the 70s, in the ARPANET, I do believe that there was less malicious hacking taking place.
Well, you would have had less malicious hacking taking place on ARPANET because you would have had mostly wealthy white guys at top-level US universities. So that makes sense. But I sort of disagree. I take issue with the fact that people wouldn't have been violating laws or social norms per se, in the 1980s or in the 1990s. You have a few extravagant examples of hacking the US military or hacking governments or using credit cards to make fraudulent purchases. I mean, these things did exist.
Of course, but it was fun.
It was.
And those are just a few examples. We didn't have commercial or other organized crime hackers back then, but we did have some bad apples. But it was tons of fun. So, but these days, I believe more and more that lots of security is actually about preserving privacy. Some users don't care, but then we care for them. But other users really care about that. So we can look at some of the difficulties of preserving privacy.
When you say hacking in this context, or security, you specifically mean the hacker type of security, though?
Yes, of course. The full one.
That's a cue for me to say something about how I don't agree that we're necessarily having services that only exploit our privacy. I do believe that there's somehow an unwarranted worry with the older part of the population, to which I count myself these days, that the kids aren't caring about privacy in the services they use. On the contrary, I think if you look at services that teenagers try to get on these days, they're very often anonymity and privacy focused. They will use Kik, which doesn't have permanent identifiers or permanent messengers. They will use stuff like Snapchat, where the messages disappear after 24 hours.
And this example here is not one of those services. We just put it there because everyone's anonymous on 4chan.
And so then you have a lot of adults complaining about how the kids are on these anonymous services because it allows them to post profane messages or engage in bullying. And so somehow the kids are still hacking the system, even though we're having all of these big services that are trying to hover up data, which is a nice message of hope, I think.
Now let's talk about the good stuff. Right, and for everyone, I believe that's just human nature. The good stuff is when you were a kid, right? Before that, it doesn't really exist. We had to research specifically, maybe not this year, right? But at some point in our lives, we had to research what ARPANET is, how it worked, and how are people feeling on it. But your childhood, that's the good times, and we had a lot of good stuff during that.
When I was little, I came on the IRC because I met some. What was the thing? I met a guy who was very into science fiction, and I liked reading books. And he told me I definitely needed to be on the IRC, and eventually I ended up in an MP3 80s channel on FNet, and this is why I still to this day listen to Italo Disco.
You know, the difference between IRC and what we have these days is the agencies that users had. They could basically self-organize, even though we had some, we had the sysadmins, or sysops was the name, but generally, at least in the region that I'm from, they kept out of the channel business. They were running the server, they were dealing with hardcore spammers, and it was quite effective.
But this was definitely the case also in Sweden. So we haven't actually introduced ourselves that much, but Kirils is from Latvia and I'm from Sweden. So nominally, we're from very different parts of the world, right? Like
right nearby.
Well, okay, so there's a sea apart. And
yes.
I think in the time period that we're talking about, you had all of these societal changes that were going on, especially around 1990, when we were both alive, by the way.
So IRC wasn't the only thing. We also had chats, right? For example, we had the web chats, and that would be some separate third party setting up web chat, not a bridge to IRC, just a separate chat where you can go and chat. And users, like the users, not the proficient hacker users, they would go and use those. But when you told them that there's this IRC with the freedom and all, they would switch over quite quickly and quite willingly, actually.
And it was places where anyone from any different geographical background could go and talk to anyone from any other particular geographic background. It was just less segmented.
Yeah, for file sharing, we had, well, they had, before our time, they had FTP. We had DC++, which was really fun. I remember that one of the ways to encourage people to share stuff they made or some other stuff that they have on their computer, it was to actually have quotas, unless you have like 10 gigabytes, or I think back then it was probably a gigabyte, right, or half a gigabyte of share, you are not allowed to download more than that. And it was a real thing. And what happened back in Latvia is that government employees were using DC++, and they wanted to download stuff, so they just shared the network share to the C++, and you could just go and download stuff. That was fun.
I can imagine.
BitTorrent came along afterwards, right? And it feels like it's been a long time, because it has been a long time. Sorry to burst your bubble if you don't think you're old. And BitTorrent made things better, right? We still have some private trackers, I guess, that actually limit how much, what share ratio you need, but it's a newer and better technology. Back before that, way before that, we had Usenet, right?
You know that one of the most shocking experiences of my life was moving to Belgium and then realizing that in Belgium, because they didn't have good internet connections in the 1990s, or just in general at any point of history, people don't have these experiences at all, because they conform a lot with what I know from my youth growing up. You know, maybe not government employees were encouraged to use BitTorrent, precisely, but there's not a single Swede my age that wouldn't know about all of these things. Whereas in Belgium and France and Germany, People, by and large, have not had affordable, good internet access because they've been stuck on ADSL networks. And so they're just somehow not part of this community that we have. I think it's very strange.
Right, having your own IP address, being able to run your own server, that was a really important part of it. We read a couple of articles preparing for this talk, how people reflect on the past. And I remember that. I should have actually put that picture in. I have a picture, I'm going to describe it since we didn't do that. I had a bed, I had a large bed. Basically half my room was the bed. And at the end of the bed, there were like 3 computers, 3 monitors, the CRT monitors, of course, with 3 keyboards on top of them. And one was for the router, which was Linux box, one was for the server, which was Linux box, and one was for the desktop, which was Windows 98. And after Windows 98 stopped working, it was a Linux box. And these days, it's harder probably, right? But we're talking about the good stuff here, right? The good old days. So you could run your own server, you could whatever you want, right? I remember it wasn't the 90s anymore. It was around 2004, 2003, I think. I started running Kylera. Anyone heard of the protocol or the service? Yeah, okay. So Kylera is a gaming server that allows you to basically 2 parties, or maybe more, but I think more than one party, connect and game an old emulator games through the internet. It's terrible. It loses sync. It desynchronizes, but it was everything we had, and it was so great to be able to to play with your friends, because people move around, right? They start growing up. RSS, the logo over here, that's a different story. It's kind of holding, I think, onto its life. It's still here, but it's barely, right? And that's a paradox, because
nowadays you're supposed to use the app.
Yes,
the smartphone, right? Yeah.
That's the thing. No one forbids you to use RSS, and some people. I personally have a blog. I haven't posted anything in a couple years, 10, I think. And it has RSS output feed, and all of these old pages that still work, they still have the feeds.
What he's actually telling you is that if you want to subscribe to an RSS feed where you have no risk of ever receiving an update, his blog is right there.
Kirils.com, yes. That's the blog, right? But because of all the open technologies back in those days, it was also easier to start up service providers, be it an actual ISP or a virtual service provider like a web page, like a blog, like a news site. I remember friends from neighbors basically started an ISP, and I connected to them, and I got a subnet immediately. I just asked, hey, can I get a subnet? Yeah, sure. There you go. There's a /8. Oh, sorry. There's I got 8 AP addresses, so that's /30/29. That's /29. Yes. Yeah. So we had all these, and we had the memes, of course, right? This is a relatively new meme, the design of it, but the content, some of you will recognize as quite an old meme, I guess. Now, these days, social networks basically survive by ingesting your data. Now, what we have created here, and by we I mean not us, someone else, but we are all party, I guess, to this extension of the good old internet, right? What has been created here is a system where the big players, the big networks, the big apps, basically say, you got to stay normal. You can't be advanced. You can't be a hacker. Stay normal. Obey slave. These are the rules. It's either my rules or the highway, right? So there are multiple problems with that, and we're gonna go over those. We're gonna touch upon those, right? One of those that I personally feel strongly about is decentralized usernames, and it's not exactly the fault of having those paid services, right? But let's say, who's the youngest person here? Let's say a young person today, or starts using the internet, and decides, okay, I want to have my presence online. So let's say the person is called John Smith or Kirils Solovjovs, right? And they go and try to register a nice handle on Twitter, a Facebook page, Instagram account. All these accounts that actually have handles. I remember as a security professional, which is my day job, we were advocating for years, just very recently, to stop using emails, email names, email account names as usernames on third-party services, because that opens up to password stuffing attacks. Well, they kind of did that. You still have the email as a username, but you also have a username as you have your handle. And the problem is you cannot realistically get the same handle everywhere. Now, back in the day, but I understand it may be very subjective, you could just go and arrange a handle because everything was run by your friends, right? Maybe these days it works the same for some other people that know Jack Dorsey or whoever runs Twitter now.
I mean, so I think the big difference between social network services and the IRC or all of the good stuff that we used to experience from the past is how they use code and coded environments to lock people into predefined behaviors and make it very difficult to stray outside. It's very difficult to reach outside of your already existing social bubbles. It's very difficult to reach outside of what somebody says that you should reasonably interested in. So this has been described in literature as the filter bubble. And I think this is what we mean by, platforms forcing people into restricted sets of behaviors. But I'm not entirely sure that I agree that decentralized usernames is that big of a problem. Shouldn't we normally think that having a separate interaction with each company still is somehow good?
It's safer, I guess, yes. But what about TLDs then, top-level domains, right? Back in the day, we had what? We had 10 GTLDs and a bunch of country TLDs. And if you were, let's say, IBM, they didn't do that, interestingly enough. But if you were IBM, you could get all the GTLDs, just in case. Now, these days, .Google, what the fuck? Do you agree with that?
I have sort of a funny counter-example to this being upsetting. And also maybe it's a local anecdote from Sweden, which doesn't concern me personally. But somebody who was very instrumental in setting up the Swedish internet architecture got his first name .se when the CCTLD system was first introduced. And then it was accidentally also later in history the name of a profitable online casino that bought the domain name from him for a large sum of money that is not disclosed.
Oh, profit. I like that.
Yeah, but he got the domain name for free because he knew the guys who were operating the registry in 1992.
That's how I got one of my domain names.
Yeah.
I just asked, hey, this is reserved. Why is this reserved?
Well, so I guess one of the problems of that model that was back in the 90s, even though it created a lot of liberties for the people who were there, is that it also relied a lot on interpersonal relations, and you would say nepotism. That, of course, if you are part of the nepotistic system and you benefit from it, you're more likely to enjoy it, yeah. And if you're not part of it, then it's not so great for you.
But you know, Amelia, your argument about TLD actually makes sense, yes, because I did manage to register Kirils.lv, Kirils.com, Kirils.org, Kirils.net. Don't open all of those. They're all different pages, but don't go looking.
I can't even get Andersdotter.se, even though it's a very unique surname that only me and my sisters have. Huh. But I think the other thing about the hacker community, which is very nice, and that I think all of these collaborative services from the 90s and early 2000s brought into the picture, was it's very constructive. So some of the things that Kirils has been talking about, setting up your own gaming servers, getting your own Usenet server, whatever, playing around with protocols, it's a constructive form of in-group to be in. Basically, you screw something up, and then you fix it, and then all of your peers, all of your friends, like you more. It's a kind of in-group status game that in many other communities, and I think especially of some of the ones we see on Instagram or social medias, they're represented more by being able to perform transactions. Like, I can buy food, I can buy a car, I can buy makeup. You know, it's a very transactional form of status game that I don't think is very good either for the human spirit or for society at large. It's like narcissism at a very large scale. The hacker community, by contrast is constructive. Only by self-improvement do you become somebody to gain respect, that gains respect. But I think that there are reasons for why we've seen some of the demise of these internet communities that go beyond just the fact that me and Kirils are now in our 30s. And it's commodification. We've had centralization of internet service provision. We've had centralization of web service provision as well. Okay, I mean, we can say like back in the 1980s, they were laying transatlantic cables, and they're also a form of centralized architecture. There's always been one level of centralization in internet, in the basic like backhaul network. But now we're seeing that centralization also locally happening. So if in the past you used to be able to run your own internet service provider and set one up, nowadays increasingly you cannot. The regulatory burden on operating commercial services for end consumers is just too high. Nobody sane would set up a network for an apartment building. Even just having an internet service provider in the city nowadays is probably outside of the realm of the possible for most companies administratively, because of the types of permissions and restrictions and hoops you need to go through with regulatory authorities.
And we may want to deny that, at least I know I do, but it also applies to services on the internet, not just the companies that pull out physical wires. What moved the popularity of a website back in the day? Well, the internet was basically a big social network. Tim created the World Wide Web, the hyperlink. And if your site was popular, people would link to it. People would talk about it. No ads, no search engine optimization. I remember when I created my blog, we wanted some ads, so we invented some ads. Instead of advertising something useful, we were advertising each other. Right? For example, for my blog, there was a rotation, and every next request, there was a different banner to a different Latvian blogger. So we didn't have what Google started, right? Search engine optimization, which basically started with Google and their algorithm.
I think also some of these websites, they were just sort of politically inconvenient, right? That you have a bunch of different people writing on blogs about their own separate opinions and making citizen journalism in a way that challenged mainstream media. And I know at least in large parts of Western Europe, you have these media subsidy systems where the government goes in and helps, for instance, newspapers with distribution costs. And all of that was challenged by the fact that now anyone can sit around and poke in municipal affairs or some government proposal or the activities of a large corporation just by having a website.
So creating a website is super easy these days. You buy a domain for $1. Next year it's like 20, but first year you buy it for $1 and you have a website. But creating a socially functioning website is basically impossible these days.
Even you have the social networks, like if you go way back to the 1990s or the 2000s early, the terms of service for one of the most popular platforms in Sweden was literally 6 paragraphs. Now there is no way that you will get on a website where you can actually talk to another physical human being in whatever form without signing on to 10 pages of legal documentation about how you are meant to litigate in California.
Right, so it's all super serious. There are companies doing these things and they are kind of pushing out. Like if you wanted to create, let's say, a social network where people can post stories that are limited in size, say up to 140 or 280 characters, you could do that. But will you get a user base? And that is something that we've been thinking about, not only preparing for this presentation, but all the time, because we need to find solutions for that.
Another part that I think really changed how people were interacting, and that we've been discussing a lot back and forth, is the major shift in internet connectivity that happened around 2012. So a large number of users that we find today on the internet didn't actually join connectivity until after the LTE revolution. So this is when people got smartphones and started being able to send and take pictures with their own phones. And I would argue, and I hope Kirils agrees with me, but otherwise we can disagree here on stage, that mobile networks are historically, just architecturally, very different from what the internet is or was. In that mobile networks assume central authorities. They're designed for having nation-state covering networks with central controlling points, which are base stations, and then a commercial entity which covers the entire territory through a spectrum license for providing connectivity on that territory, somehow forwarding and acting as a middleman for anything that is being said and done. And this is just a vastly different model of connectivity and how to build infrastructure from what the internet was designed to be, which is having a large number of smaller networks which are capable of interoperating and peering with each other. And so you can see this in what the different functions are that are meant to be supported by end-user equipment or network service providers. These are some illustrations that I made for a framework on human rights and internet standardization. But so on the left, what you have is basically the internet model for network service provision. You see the end user equipment is the green column, and the yellow column is the service provider. So among the service providers, you have basically 3 different places where you can have different commercial entities performing completely different tasks, and that can all technologically, by design, interoperate and cooperate with each other to provide something to the end users. Also in the end user equipment, you have a lot of different entities that need to get together and cooperate for the end user to do something meaningful. The end user, a consumer or a client or somebody like Kirils, can choose to intervene at any stage of that process and do whatever they want. In the mobile network model, on the contrary, the end user equipment, that column, it's on the right, well, it's the 3rd column from the left, if that's how you're reading it, has very little influence over what's going on. If you're just somebody who's relying on the connectivity, you need a SIM card to get access to the network, and then that's basically it. From a connectivity point of view, that's where your interaction with the network technology stops. It's a very centralized model. It leaves very little flexibility. The network service provider rules supreme. They control all parts of the stack. And unless you're actually physically working with somebody that is developing network equipment, you're just very unlikely to have any influence over what the network is capable of or what the services are that you can run. And I think the fact that many of the people who are now getting onto the internet or that got onto the internet after 2012, that they're in this mobile network model, that influence what kind of freedoms that they perceive themselves to have when interacting with a smartphone or a computer or with any type of connected gadgets. Maybe going back to an earlier observation that we make, it's not so much that we're old in the sense of being, of age, or that we're in our 30s or whatever. What me and Kirils are actually reacting to is the fact that we got on the internet before the LTE revolution. We want it to be this internet model where anyone can intervene at any level of the value chain to do whatever they want. But we find ourselves increasingly surrounded by these mobile network people who are of any age, really, born in any decade, but that find themselves very limited in terms of what they can architecturally do.
Now, back in the day, as we discussed, for a lengthy period of time now, free services were actually a thing. As Amelia mentioned, we had fewer regulatory requirements. In particular, you didn't have to have as many certifications and permissions, right? It's akin to setting a bank. You need a bunch of certificates and security stuff to do that. And for social networks, it's quite similar, especially if you're in the EU. You have to abide by the GDPR, you have to have lawyers and all that.
Yeah, so I guess it's not entirely true that you need more lawyers now. It's always been possible to sue people on the internet or for stuff that was done on the internet. It was just less jurisprudence in the past.
I'm not sure if it was possible, because that was a turning point when, was it in Sweden, when someone got sued for raping someone virtually, in the virtual avatar?
They actually changed the law because it wasn't possible to sue somebody over that. It wasn't possible to prosecute, so they changed the law so that it became possible. Yeah. But there's a bunch of other regulatory influence as well. One of the things that I have found is that whenever we have a law which somehow mysteriously centralizes the power over internet architecture or how we build them, is that big telcos in Europe that used to be government-owned, typically, well, I will not mention any names actually because I work in the telecommunications sector now. But there's just a bunch of them. They used to be government monopolies, and they have they're responsible for paying out pension funds to anyone who's been employed there since the 1960s. And those pension funds needs present-day profits to exist. So that means that in order for, when a German politician is trying to make an assessment of what to do politically, they have about 200,000 German old-age pensioners who, if a large German operator is not allowed to do rent-seeking on their consumers, they will be forced to eat cat food. And I can sort of see the moral dilemma for the legislator in this case, that maybe I would also allow anti-competitive behavior and centralization of architecture if the alternative was cat food to pensioners. I disagree with the effects though, and I think the pension fund problem should maybe be solved differently if possible. But I think it's one of the driving forces of centralization, that we just have all of these legacy industries that are consistently getting support by legislators because they can't keep up with what a decentralized architectural infrastructure model would actually mean for them. Another part which is now increasingly driving centralization of services is security. But I don't mean security in the sense of hacking for people's privacy, more like nation-state security. That if we're going to be protecting people from somebody being nasty on Twitter, it makes sense to have more regulated services so that Twitter can moderate. Or we're imagining that a large entity like a big bank can better put money into developing security for payment transactions, this kind of thing. Although that's being challenged a bit by the fintech sector. So there's a bunch of security-related arguments which are used for centralization now as well. Basically, if it's a big and old entity, you can better trust it. Somehow very appealing, especially in continental Europe.
And then we have copyright, of course, or the Mickey Mouse law. Basically, I don't know how you feel about it, but personally feel that copyright is just wrong. Not copyright in general. I'm an author myself. I sometimes write something. I take photos, but I don't feel like I need to be able to benefit from the article I wrote 70 years after I'm dead, because I won't care personally. I don't know about others, but the real problem with copyright is basically this: it's way too long, and so people on the internet, the netizens, they try to find ways around it, and it's getting harder and harder. And not just talking about illegal activities or what is illegal under current law. I'm also talking about perfectly normal activities. For example, around 2006 or 5, I created a file sharing platform. It wasn't BitTorrent or anything like that. No fancy protocols. It was a web page. Back then, so basically these days we have Mega, I think. Mega.nz is one of the popular ones. Back in the day, the best thing you could ask for is you had like paste bin kind of platforms where you upload one file, you get one link. So the problem I was solving was, what if I want to upload like 20 related files? I want them all to be like in one virtual folder. So I created a platform for that. And people use it for personal file transfer. It hasn't taken off, even though I was surprised. When I was in a European Union building once, I was using their computer to browse stuff. I tried to transfer a file, and their firewall forbid me. It said, this is a file sharing service. You are not going to open it. So apparently some people are paid to look for stuff like that on the internet and find it. But the problem for me with copyright here is that European Union decided that, you know, since I'm a file sharing platform, I need to start looking after what's being uploaded, right, if I don't want to get sued. And I have 3 users per month. I'd say about 20 people per year use the platform. So I cannot afford an AI. I hate AIs that are used for this oppressive purpose. And I cannot afford the 24/7 staff that will reply to copyright infringement requests. Now, all of that to me shows that we are losing agency on the internet really fast, or we have been for the past decade. These days, you have to have an account on many pages just to open it, just to read the page. I'm not even talking about all the banners you have to click on, right? I agree to the cookies, yes. Do you want to be tracked? No. Are you sure? Yes. Okay, choose the platforms you don't want to be tracked on. All that. I'm not even talking about all of that. There are more and more sites where you need to have an account. And I understand the need for financing for good journalism, for example. But there has to be a solution. This has to be solved. I'm okay.
We could have had a solution. We could have had citizen journalism, but then we decided we didn't like it.
Yeah, so people don't know what they want. But I could make the account. I mean, I could pay, but I don't want to make 10 accounts, right? If there was just a button that can be pressed, right? A phone number. Famously on this stage, I think also, I've given the presentation on privacy about 3 years ago. Those who were here remember that I live without a phone number. Well, not like one of the audience members here who actually doesn't have a phone number. But I do tell companies I don't have a phone number because it's way too hard to explain that I don't want to give you my phone number. I don't trust you enough. And it's just try it out. It's super hard. And it's the same thing. Accounts, the phone, the centralized ban systems, the ban hammers. If you do something bad, you're banned. So I've had the same IP address that I use for browsing the web since the IP address was assigned to an endpoint. No one else in the history of the internet has ever used that IP address. I get Google captchas all the time because I don't use JavaScript. And anyway, that's a different thing. But it's an example of how we are losing agency because these big corporations, they collude and they do what's easier for them.
Well, they also act on a political imperative, as in we have people who get angry with people who say nasty things on the internet, and they ask their legislators to intervene, and the legislators go to the big companies and say, look, you need to find a way of identifying these people, and the companies say, the phone number seems to be a very good way of identifying people, because remember, we're stuck in this mobile network architecture where anyway the user SIM card defines exactly who you are, because that's the architecture that we're in.
We're not at the end of the road yet. I just noticed this month that Reddit, the popular platform, has changed age verification rules. In August, if a post was marked NSFW, you could click, yes, I'm 18. Now you have to log in. So we're not at the end of the road yet. It's going to get worse, guys.
I can see it getting worse.
So, by the way, the picture here is my personal take on Google's "Don't be evil." That should be their new slogan. So we are losing control. We had GTLDs, right? Then we needed CCTLDs. That's fine. Every country needs their own agency on the internet, and the agency of a country is protected much more than agency of an individual on the internet, I believe. By that logic now, the internet started with some neutral CAs. Okay, to be fair, it probably started with some governmental military CAs in the US, but it started with some relatively neutral CAs, certificate authorities. But by that logic, we therefore need also national government CAs. Like, let's say, Russia can't trust the CAs of Mozilla Corporation because they're an American company, so they need Russian government CA. There are also corporate certificate stores now. Just recently, I think it was Chrome 105, when Google announced that for the benefit of the users, as they always do, why suspect us? For the benefit of the users, they will now run their own certificate store. Their argument was simple. So if a user is on an Android phone, some websites work. Some HTTPS.
I can sort of see why it happens, though, that Google and Mozilla set up their own certificate stores. Because part of the discussion that at least I've been in for the past 10 years is whether on the internet we're finding increasing influence from, say, bad nation-state actors. And Kirils already mentioned a large country in the East that a lot of people at the present time take big issue with. But we can imagine any number of nation-states that have different political opinions from one another, and this leading to diplomatic exchanges of a less polite nature. But so in the nature of being a nation state is also kind of the feeling of being in and of yourself good, you know? And if you diverge from that, dichotomy, you run into the problem of who decides what is the good policy for a particular territory at a particular time. You know, who is the arbitrator of what's good and bad. Google and Mozilla, they're both US-based organizations, so we'd say that when they sell their certificate, maybe they do it under a moral framework and a political imperative, which is colored by the jurisdiction where they're based. Is this something that in Europe we find acceptable? A lot of the legislative initiatives that we've seen in the European Union for the past 10 years are colored by the fact that some people in the EU, some countries, I will not mention any names, but they're large and hexagonal, feel that the US does not reflect the values that we want to necessarily embody in the internet architectures and services that we build in Europe.
Right, but the difference between, let's say, authoritarian regimes and democratic states is just the reason why they are doing it. They're doing the same thing. Couple days ago, when I was trying to understand, is Putin going to declare war on my country now? And I tried to open Kremlin.ru. I couldn't, because Latvian government decided it's bad for me to look at that site, and it was blocked. So each of them have their own agenda for becoming CA or doing filtering or blocking. But research done more than 5 years ago actually identified that even though certificate authorities in a system are quite limited in number, for example, here we have Android. It has around 200 certificate authorities, and some of them are governmental directly, but we have this cool thing in CAs as in PKA as delegated trust. So basically, most CAs can actually say, okay, you're going to be a CA as well. And there is a cool research paper. You should check this one out and some more on the topic. So it was found, I believe, that some really strange, really shady country postal offices were CAs, some military agencies were CAs, some universities were CAs, like CA that could literally sign Google.com at the time. These days, it's fixed in a way that, you know, there's certificate transparency, there's public keeping, if you believe in that. So there are different things you can do.
So what Kirils actually means to say is that he agrees that nation states should not run their own CAs. Yeah. And I would argue that this is one of the beneficial parts of the internet the way that it used to be. Nation states simply had less influence, and we had less territorial mark on what moral values existed there. This is what I call my own postmodernist paradigm of the internet. Rather than believing that the internet necessarily needs to embody any particular version of history that goes in a particular direction, having an endpoint, the moral values that are the best. The internet used to be a place where you could have all sorts of people making all sorts of arguments and forming their own communities in the way that they saw fit. It's basically a large chaos leading to nowhere in particular, and that was also the great thing. The internet, you could argue, also the web, actually wasn't ever really economically beneficial. If you compare the impact of internet technologies and computers to something like the pharmaceutical industry, it's provided very little in terms of economic use. You know, okay, we can argue logistic chains. There we have really large benefits of information technologies, but by and large, it's like a self-orchestrating system. And the absolutely largest impact that internet and web communities have had on people is that they are able to talk, that they're able to communicate, that they're able to share experiences, build communities outside of their own geographical boundaries. The internet is essentially a postmodernist tool for peace, which in the 1990s was also how the internet was largely sold. There used to be these big European events, and in Sweden, also in the US, where they would have small children come on stage, get an ice cream, talk about how in the future everyone was going to be friends. We were at the end of history, and it was just one big spiral down to universal harmony from here. And we need to get back to that place. And we have some challenges to the existing incumbents. Bitcoin is challenging the banking system. We can argue at what level of success they're doing so, but they've tried. Mastodon is challenging Twitter by trying to provide a decentralized platform for short messages instead of having one centralized server. We also have open source software challengers to Slack, which was in itself a challenge to email.
And it's not only on technical level. If we take a look at the societal level, you can see BitTorrent as a challenger to the incumbents in the media distribution industry. Now, what's more important these days than social networks? You wouldn't believe, but it's actually email. It's still, by some metrics, more popular than social networks. And the problem with email is that it's getting killed. And it's not getting killed in a similar manner as we've seen some other technologies killed. There is no, well, at least I'd like to believe that there is no grand scheme to make email unworkable.
I work in a big company now, and I would not say that email is dead.
But the big companies actually they benefit from the email not being workable because they want it easier for themselves. Now, back in the day when I started, when I started with a server and a router that was routing my /29 subnet in my bedroom, that was when I started self-hosting my email server at Kirils.com. It's been 20 years. I'm still hosting my email on a physical server. I have self-hosted email for 20 years, but it was easy back then. These days, it's hard. I don't even subscribe personally to some of the new proper security technologies that have been applied to email, which you should use, like domain keys is a good technology. I just don't bother with it. But I've read that some other people in my position that have been self-hosting email for 15, 20 years have given up. Because they do subscribe to everything. They do domain keys, they do SPF, they do the reverse PTR records, everything. And they just don't get delivered. Because it's easier for the big corporations just to filter out all the small unofficial email providers and just deal with the big ones. Processing spam is expensive. Even though, for example, Google have gotten really good at filtering out email, you can't imagine how many spam emails per second arrive at Google servers. And most of those don't end up in your spam folder. They just get shadow banned.
And maybe the even worst part is that the big companies get plus points from legislators doing this because they can then say, oh, we're benefiting user security.
And to prove that, here's a screenshot, right? This is the thing, CSA. So basically what they say is, well, you get our certification and you're gonna get deliverability advantages. So what the hell is that? We have a SMTP protocol. It's been there for, I think it was invented right after ARPANET, I believe. And it works. It's great. It's like sending a postcard. You can write whoever you want it came from. You can see the content of it, even if it's not addressed to you. I love SMTP. It's such a great tool when I teach security courses. But seriously, though, it's really sad.
You can also fake headers.
Yes, you can, of course, fake headers, right? Seriously, though, I feel like it's true. The email is dying. Luckily for me, I'm okay so far. Both my personal email and my company email, which we also self-host, are getting delivered more or less. The only problem is Gmail. But we managed to migrate lots of customers away from Gmail by saying they don't know how to filter spam. So that's one way to go at it. Now what?
Yeah, now what? Well, one of the drawbacks of the democratic system is that legislators aren't really appreciated for doing nothing. So that's probably not going to be an option.
So what is the realistic direction then?
Well, I think, and this is partially based on my own personal experience from the lockdown periods, which I spent finding this large demographic or actually interacting with a lot of these people that started using the internet after 2012. I think we need better media literacy. I've discovered that there's an entire segment of the population that has smartphones with Android and an internet connection, but they don't Google. There's the search bar is right there at the bottom of their screen every day when they use the internet, but the only thing they use the device for is taking pictures and sending it to their friends. Absolutely remarkable. How can we get, I mean, I've spent, 10 years of my life trying to get people to use privacy-preserving Google, like alternatives to Google, and then there's all of these people that they don't even use Google to begin with. So media literacy, for sure, that's something we need. Better regulation. I think we need better regulation, even though I'm generally pessimistic about the direction that European legislators have set out. I also don't think that it's feasible or even good not to have any regulation at all.
Well, I'm still an optimist, and I think we can still try to self-regulate. We don't want EU or the World Trade Organization coming in and fixing our emails for us.
No, but they can regulate the behavior of large entities, hopefully in the direction that smaller entities are giving a more fair chance at entering the market and staying there, or providing non-commercial services if that's their desire. You just need to have that public commitment and the social view of what the internet could or should be.
I think that's a really important part. We are lacking the majority, not in the government, not in the corporations, in the society. Lots of people really don't care about that much. So we can look at some technical solutions here.
Which we'll have to do quickly because we're running out of time.
But those only work if we do get the public commitment. Federated social networks, Fediverse. It's a really cool tool. Unfortunately, it's not working too well.
Because of the incumbent advantage already held by large commercial services like Twitter and Facebook. Part of the reason for which I think is, again, that me and Kirils, for instance, we started using the internet when it was mostly text-based. And so what the commercial services were really able to exploit was that people like pictures. And then federated social networks, they haven't been able to retake that.
I mean, I feel it's a great concept, actually, and the real problem is, right, the existing networks are not federated. That's the only problem. But Twitter has a separate, just under sea-level board that deals with federation. They actually are proactively looking into that. Nothing has happened yet, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. IPFS, Interplanetary File System. Now, this is a quite a small thing, but it's a profound thing, I believe. It changed the way we can actually store data and we can reference data. So we don't need DNS, we don't need third parties. It's like Bitcoin for file storage. The good part of Bitcoin for file storage. Now, then there's Solid. The interesting part about Solid is that Solid was created by Tim, the same Tim that created the World Wide Web. So it was created just a couple years ago. We are still to see what Solid will actually bring to the web and if it will be able to fix it.
So on a final note, when we had fewer content and security laws, and perhaps tragically fewer national interests defended, we also had people choosing to use services that allowed them to contribute or make changes to all parts of the technical infrastructure. There were two-way streets, not just influencers and pictures. And now that we're in this new era of idols and centralization, moving forward is not just as easy as developing a new technical protocol. We have a few ideas, and Kirils presented. But it's not going to be enough. We need the social aspect and we need the media literacy part as well. We need to build new social norms. We need to gather the masses behind us and we need to get politicians that buy into this vision of the internet as a bridge between communities for people, for them to make the organization and technologies that they want. And part of that work must be a public commitment. Seeing the internet or the web for the social tool that it is.
The end.
So I'm not sure if we have time for questions or if there's anything to ask. 5 minutes, great. Here's the question mic then.
First of all, thank you for your nice presentation. And I wanted to ask you, don't you maybe feel, you mentioned how in the old days of the internet, when we were all in the IRCs and stuff like that, like communities were different than they are globally now, and totally agree. But don't you think there are also now happening sub-communities inside all of those places that are super popular, like private Facebook groups, like Groups.io, and I don't know, Discord channels that actually have the same like community vibe that old groups had, and they of course by definitions aren't global and like approachable to everybody except for those people who actually want to be there. And I don't feel they're also monitored or moderated more than the old groups were by the local admins or such. So don't you think maybe the community is actually finding a way to I don't know, express itself in some other ways?
We're probably going to have a different answer, each of us, to every question here. So my take on that is that, first of all, they are really heavily moderated. Facebook records every message that you send before you send it, even if you delete it before sending. It also applies to community groups, and they look at the content and they intervene when they feel necessary. A second point that I'd like to make is Facebook is not for everybody. I've tried. When connecting with new social circles, I've tried to create a Facebook account with a fake name, of course. It gets deleted in 1 week. And for the group itself, I feel, personally for me, that's the biggest risk. I don't feel that I can trust Facebook or Google or any large corporation not to delete my stuff if something happens. We've had this case recently where a couple, a man and wife I think, were exchanging pictures of the genitals of their son because it was COVID, and they had to forward it to the doctor because there was an infection or something. And the guy's Google account got locked and deleted.
So I think my take on that would be broadly similar. The weakness of Facebook is that it's just one entity, and it's very difficult to make it more than one. They're under one jurisdiction, but they're also an easy target for anyone that wants to impose moderation requirements on them. And so whenever you do anything that goes out of what is the moderated requirement, you're basically vulnerable. And it's true that you can find some examples of when Facebook has been used for dissident activities. You would say the Northern African political riots that happened back in 2010, 2011. Facebook was an extremely important platform for people to get videos out of when they were getting beaten up by the police. But ultimately, that was also because somebody over the US decided that it was politically opportune for them at the time to have political unrest in that region of the world. And so it's kind of double-edged sword, Facebook. I think we are provided with greater flexibility to empower ourselves if we have a more decentralized way of building infrastructures that we communicate through.
Thank you. Hi. I had an issue with the Facebook which you mentioned. It's a rather rare one, I think. Once I don't use it. I just have an account which I barely use. And once I tried to log, didn't insert a good password, and they blocked me. When I tried to change my password, they asked for a number. ID number, passport number, all kinds of numbers. I refused, of course, because I don't need Facebook, but if I entered my ID number, how do they know if it is correct? Do they know? Do they have all my numbers already? To cut it short, after a month, when I tried to log in, this input field changed and I could change my password without them asking for my ID numbers. So it's, to me, it's rather rare.
Yeah, I can only commend your committal to keeping your privacy. I had absolutely the same experience. And personally, I feel like, at least in the EU, and maybe even the whole world with time, governments will regulate these platforms enough that they cannot just arbitrarily delete or block. But I'm afraid that the way they're going to solve it is this: they're going to ask for ID. And I also don't feel comfortable with that at all, not at the slightest.
I mean, there's also the separate thing that could happen, which is that the cool kids nowadays don't use Facebook, I don't think. Like the youngsters, they're on Snapchat. I've seen it.
It's not better.
Well,
Same problems.
Also,
Oh, there's-
none at the back.
Over there.
Oh, we're actually out of time. Final question.
No problem. So to me, what you've identified here is a problem of economics of scale. So decentralized network, as the internet, was, as it grows, it becomes more centralized due to economies of scale. So to me, to retake the internet, you would either have to get rid of some of these incentives that make it grow a certain way, or you would have to, as I believe has historically been done, just build something new. So do you have any comments as to that?
I agree. Very many thanks for bringing that point. It is definitely true that this is an economic problem and a social problem, and that we currently have politicians and regulatory frameworks in the world, not just locally, but also regionally in Europe and globally through the World Trade Organization, but also otherwise, that benefit the rise of centralized services more than they benefit decentralized services. And this is why I feel very strongly that we need this social and public commitment to having an economic model that works differently, that allows us to benefit from these communication technologies in a way that I think lies closer to what people's actual preferences for the use of the technologies are, but also in just a way that is better for mankind, let's say.
To add to that, so for me, even if, let's say, Facebook is still the largest social network, it being federated means that I can connect to it from my own server and other people can do that. And I wouldn't mind in that case that it's where it's centralized and that's where the majority of users are. So I think that way we could at least buy ourselves some time until the same thing that happened to email also happens to this system.
We could hope perhaps also that the advertisement market crashes. I've been secretly waiting for this moment. I think there's
Thank you so much for your questions and thank you for being here. Have a good BalCCon.